Okay, we are now on to the tie back to the open with impact portion of the conclusion capsuled lectures. And do note, I've called this the close with impact in some preceding versions of the course. I just recently came across this label by a colleague of mine, and I liked it much better than close with impact because I think tie back to the open with impact is a little more descriptive in the labeling and kind of tells you exactly what it does. So there you go. The tie back to the open with impact is very related to the open with impact. So the tools that I teach in this course for opening with impact are story, list, and quotation. So guess what you can use in the tie back? You can use a story, list, or a quotation. Just make sure all of those lessons I taught you earlier about how to open with a story well, a list well, and a quotation well, that you follow those same rules in your tie back. All right, so now I'm going to talk to you about ways to actually generate your open with impact. So one of the things that you could do, I call this finish on slide 6 in the PowerPoint. One thing you could do is just finish whatever you started in your open with impact. Let's imagine that you had a story, and I give the example in the PowerPoint of like grandma, and there I saw grandma hooked up to the machines. Let's imagine that that's the very last line of your open with impact. Then you go through your entirety of your speech. When you get to the tie back, what you could do is just finish that. So there was grandma hooked up to the machines. And I thought to myself, the wonders of science have saved her life. And then you keep going on with sensory details, those kinds of things, right? So you can just finish what you started. And maybe it's not a story, maybe it's a list, and your list is incomplete. So maybe you had a list of like 4 people or 5 people in your open with impact. Maybe there's 5 other famous people, for example, that have diabetes. So you do 5 stars with diabetes, and then maybe you go ahead and do 5 more famous people with diabetes. So you just finish what you started. Okay, so that's what finish means. Tie back to the open with impact by finishing what you started. Or you could simply duplicate it. And particularly in limited prep situations where you don't have a lot of time, if you've written an open with impact with 5 people, why don't you, when you get to the tie back, why don't you just repeat those same 5 people? So you can actually just duplicate, do the exact same thing. Or maybe you do the exact same thing, but add 1 or 2 things on there. So if you opened with impact with a story in your tie back, you could actually use the same story, and maybe put 1 or 2 extra details at the very end of it if you want. You don't have to. You could actually just tell the exact same story. So duplicate your open with impact, particularly in a limited prep situation where you don't have a lot of time. So if you open and you have a nice open, why don't you use the same thing to do your tie back? Okay. You could oppose, you could do the opposite. So let's imagine that you start off with a story of 5 people that are had lots of money and power, and they were terrible people. So maybe your speech is about capitalism. And so maybe the whole speech is pro-capitalism. And what you could do is finish with a list of 5 people who had lots of money and power, but did good things with it, right? So you could start off with here's the bad, here's the good. Particularly if it's a persuasive speech, that's very common. So maybe these are the bad things about antibiotics. And then in your close, maybe you're talking about changing the way we use antibiotics or using different kinds of antibiotics. You could do the 5 good things that will come from the world that you describe. Maybe your story is, here's a story of somebody who didn't get the kind of mental health assistance that they needed. So maybe down here, you could finish off with the story of somebody who did get the help that they needed and wonderful thing happens. All right. So oppose, do the opposite of what you started with. All right. And then last is variation. Just because you open with impact with story doesn't mean that you can't tie back to the open with something like a list or tie back to the open with a quotation. So you used a tool in the open with impact. In the tie back, you don't have to use the same tool, is the point with variation. Just make sure that whatever you're doing to accentuate that relationship between the open with impact and the tie back, that you've done so thoughtfully and with art. And if you do that, then your speech is probably going to be awesome. Okay, so that's all I have to say about the tie back to the open with impact. If I called it close with impact a couple of times, just know that the language is very similar and I'm just getting in the habit of using this. So I hope that helps you.